Hey guys, tonight we're not just going to talk about history, we're going to live it. Imagine, if you will, that you're standing on the precipice of a new life, the roar of 1,000 dreams filling your ears, the promise of glittering gold practically shimmering in the air before you. You've journeyed for months, perhaps years, driven by tales of fortunes found overnight, of nuggets the size of potatoes, of a life free from the drudgery you left behind. You see yourself, pickaxe in hand, striking bedrock, and clink, there it is, pure, unadulterated gold, enough to buy a mansion, a sprawling ranch, or simply enough to finally stop working. That vision is so clear, so intoxicating, that you hardly notice the thin, acrid dust coating your throat or the distant, mournful howl of a lone coyote. This, my friends, is the Wild West Gold Rush, and if you were actually there, you probably wouldn't survive it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always cool to see how far these sleepy stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step off the dusty trail, your boots sinking into the churned-up earth of what's optimistically called a boomtown. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap whiskey, and something vaguely metallic. Maybe the lingering scent of blasting powder, or perhaps just the raw earth itself, newly exposed. This isn't the idyllic, sun-drenched valley you pictured in your fever dreams back east. No, this is a chaotic, sprawling encampment, a temporary monument to human greed and desperate hope. Tents lean precariously against hastily erected shacks, their canvas ripped, their wooden frames warped. The ground is a muddy, rutted mess, crisscrossed by countless footprints, each one a testament to another soul drawn to this feverish promise. You squint, trying to make sense of the cacophony. Hammers clang against rock, shouts echo from makeshift saloons, and the distant, rhythmic thud of a stamp mill pounds an incessant, almost maddening beat. The truth hits you almost immediately, a cold splash of reality. The gold, if it's here, isn't just lying on the surface, glinting invitingly. It's buried, often deep, and extracting it requires not just effort, but immense, back-breaking, soul-crushing labor. You see men, many of them just as new to this as you are, their faces streaked with grime and sweat, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. They wield picks and shovels with a desperate urgency, their movements stiff and uncoordinated. Some are already nursing injuries, bandaged hands, or limping gaits, silent reminders of the dangerous work. The romantic notion of a quick fortune evaporates faster than water in the desert sun. This isn't a treasure hunt. It's a fight for survival against the very earth itself, and the odds, you realize with a sinking feeling, are stacked heavily against you. Historians still argue whether the initial influx of hopefuls genuinely believed gold was simply abundant on the surface, or if they were merely swept up in a collective delusion fueled by sensationalized newspaper reports. What is clear is that the reality was a brutal awakening. One common misconception was that you could simply pan for gold dust in any stream. While panning was indeed a method, the easy pickings were often gone within weeks of a discovery, leaving only the more challenging, less profitable deposits. You quickly learn that your romanticized image of the lone prospector striking it rich with a single swing of a pickaxe is a fantasy. The real gold is often microscopic, embedded in quartz veins, or mixed with tons of worthless rock, requiring complex and dangerous processes to extract. The initial rush might have been driven by dreams, but the staying power, for the few who had it, was fueled by sheer, unadulterated stubbornness. That first harsh dose of reality barely scratches the surface, though. Before you even set foot in that miserable, muddy camp, you had to get there. And getting there? Well, that was its own special kind of hell. Forget your comfy, climate-controlled train rides or zipping across the country in an air-conditioned car. Your journey west was less a scenic adventure and more a prolonged, agonizing test of endurance. You likely started your trek months, maybe even a year, before you ever saw the glint of a pickaxe. The most common routes, whether by sea or by land, were fraught with peril, each promising a unique flavor of misery. If you chose the sea route around Cape Horn, you were in for an absolutely mind-numbing journey. Imagine being cooped up on a wooden ship for 4 to 8 months, battling seasickness, scurvy, and the sheer, unending monotony of the open ocean. Your cabin would be a cramped, shared space, often infested with vermin, smelling of stale bilge water and unwashed bodies. Food would quickly become rancid, waterfoul, and every creak of the ship's timbers would remind you of the vast, indifferent expanse of water separating you from anything remotely resembling civilization. One particularly quirky tidbit is that some ships, desperate for fresh provisions, would actually stop at remote islands to collect turtle meat, which was thought to be a good source of vitamins, though it certainly didn't prevent all scurvy. You'd dream of fresh fruit and vegetables, only to wake up to another serving of hardtack and salted pork. And then there were the storms. Oh, the storms. You'd be tossed about like a toy, the waves threatening to swallow your flimsy vessel whole, every moment a terrifying dance with the deep. Historians still argue whether the psychological toll of such isolation was more damaging than the physical hardships faced by overland travelers. Then there was the overland journey, often across vast, uncharted territories. You joined a wagon train, a slow, creaking caravan of hopefuls, each laden with their meager possessions and boundless optimism. This path, while avoiding the seasickness, introduced a whole new set of nightmares. Disease, especially cholera, swept through these trains like a phantom reaper, felling strong men and women in a matter of hours. You'd watch friends and family sicken and die, buried in shallow, unmarked graves along the trail, their dreams ending abruptly in a desolate landscape. There were also the constant threats of broken axles, stampedes, and encounters with desperate, sometimes hostile, Native American tribes whose lands you were encroaching upon. You learned to sleep with one eye open, the sounds of the wilderness a constant reminder of your vulnerability. Your days were a relentless cycle of walking, pushing, and pulling, the sun beating down mercilessly, the dust clogging your lungs. You'd cross rivers, sometimes swollen and treacherous, losing wagons and livestock to the powerful currents. It was a brutal form of natural selection, ensuring that only the hardiest, or perhaps the luckiest, made it through. You'd think that once you arrived, the worst was over, but the journey had merely stripped you down to your most basic, exhausted self, utterly unprepared for the next layer of hardship. Remember that feeling of stepping onto that dusty, chaotic camp? That exhaustion you felt? A significant portion of it wasn't from the mining itself, but from the sheer ordeal of getting there. You were already halfway defeated before you even began swinging a pick. It's no wonder many turned back, or simply gave up, realizing the golden dream was more a mirage shimmer than a solid reality. So, you've somehow survived the journey, a weary, dust-covered ghost of your former self. You arrive, expecting a clear path to riches, only to find chaos. The first, and arguably most frustrating, hurdle you'd face once you got to the gold fields wasn't the hard rock or the lack of water. It was the absolute free-for-all when it came to claiming land. This, my friend, was the Wild West, and organized law, like a good night's sleep, was a rare and precious commodity. You quickly learned that finders keepers is the unofficial motto, but it comes with a dangerous caveat, if you can hold on to it. Imagine staking out a promising plot of land, spending days, perhaps weeks, digging, sifting, dreaming of what lies beneath. You mark your corners with posts, perhaps even put up a crude tent. You feel a glimmer of hope, a whisper of "this is it." Then you wake up one morning, or return from a quick trip to the nearest general store, to find another miner, or a group of them, actively working your claim. They've moved your markers, kicked over your tent, and are now, with brazen arrogance, digging right where you were. This, my friend, is claim jumping, and it was as common as dust storms and bad whiskey. There was no central land office, no orderly system of deeds or titles in the early days. It was largely first come, first served, and the rules were often made up on the fly by the miners themselves, or by the strongest, most ruthless individual in the camp. You might appeal to a makeshift miners' court, a gathering of rough men who often had their own vested interests, or who might be swayed by a quick bribe or the glint of a well-placed revolver. Justice was swift, brutal, and often biased. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of claim jumping ultimately deterred more miners than it enriched, given the constant threat it posed to genuine prospectors. The notion of might makes right was terrifyingly literal. Think about it. You've poured every ounce of your dwindling savings into equipment and the journey itself. Your claim is your entire future. To have it simply taken, by force or by cunning, without any real recourse, was enough to break even the strongest spirit. You'd stand there, pickaxe still in hand, watching someone else profit from your discovery, and your options were stark. You could fight, risking life and limb against armed men who likely had nothing to lose. You could appeal to the community, hoping for some sense of fairness, which was often in short supply. Or, most commonly, you could simply pack up your meager belongings and move on, hoping for better. Or even rig up crude booby traps, though these were often more dangerous to the miners setting them than to any potential claim jumper. You'd hear stories, whispered around campfires, of desperate men defending their tiny plots with their lives, or of clever tricks used to scare off rivals. The sheer lack of a robust, enforceable legal framework meant that your hard-won piece of earth was always under threat, adding yet another layer of stress to an already brutal existence. You carried not just your tools and your hopes, but also the constant gnawing fear that everything you worked for could be stolen in the blink of an eye. This wasn't just about losing a day's wages. It was about losing your entire future, your reason for being there. The constant vigilance, the distrust of strangers, the ever-present threat of violence. It all chipped away at your soul, making the dream of gold feel less like liberation and more like a cruel, unending nightmare. So, let's say you've managed to hold on to your claim for a day, a week, maybe even a month, through sheer luck or intimidation. Now comes the actual work. Forget the images of sleek, powerful machinery you see in modern documentaries. You, my friend, were working with tools that were barely more advanced than those used by ancient Egyptians. This wasn't just hard labor. This was a Sisyphean struggle against tons of unforgiving rock and dirt, day in and day out, with your body as the primary engine. Your most valuable possessions would be a pickaxe, a shovel, a pan, and perhaps a rocker box or sluice box. Let's start with the pickaxe. It's heavy, unwieldy, and designed for brute force. You'd spend hours, back bent, swinging that heavy tool, chipping away at stubborn earth, breaking apart quartz veins, hoping for that glint of yellow. Each swing sent jarring vibrations up your arms, your shoulders screaming in protest, your hands quickly developing blisters that would then tear open, only to be rubbed raw by the coarse handles. And the shovel? It wasn't for dainty gardening. You'd be moving incredible volumes of dirt and gravel, scooping it into buckets or wheelbarrows, then hauling it to the nearest water source. Imagine doing this for 10, 12, even 14 hours a day, under a blazing sun or in the chilling damp, with no breaks, no ergonomic design, just raw physical effort. Then there's the gold pan. This simple, round metal dish was your most direct interface with your fortune. You'd fill it with gravel and water, then skillfully swirl, shake, and tip it, using the specific gravity of gold to separate the heavier metal from the lighter debris. It sounds simple, right? It's not. It requires immense patience, a delicate touch, and hours of practice to do efficiently. You'd stand hunched over a freezing stream, your hands numb, your back aching, your eyes straining for the faintest sparkle. Most of what you found wouldn't be glittering nuggets, but tiny, almost microscopic flakes, known as gold dust or flour gold. A mainstream historical fact is that even experienced panners could spend an entire day for just a few dollars worth of gold, if they were lucky. For a bit more efficiency, you might graduate to a rocker box or a sluice box. A rocker box was essentially a cradle-like device that you'd rock back and forth while pouring water and gravel through it, the gold catching on riffles at the bottom. A sluice box was a longer, stationary trough with a series of cleats or riffles that would trap the gold as water carried the lighter material away. These were improvements, certainly, but they still required constant feeding of material, a steady water supply, and manual labor to operate. You weren't just digging. You were also carrying hundreds of pounds of earth, gravel, and water. Historians still argue whether the invention of more efficient mechanical processes like stamp mills ultimately benefited the average prospector or merely consolidated wealth into the hands of larger companies. One quirky tidbit about these early methods is that miners would sometimes use mercury in their sluice boxes to amalgamate with the gold, making it easier to collect. While effective, they had no idea of the severe long-term health risks from mercury poisoning, a silent killer that would claim many lives years later. You were quite literally poisoning yourself in pursuit of wealth, unaware of the insidious damage. Each day ended with your body screaming in protest, your clothes caked in mud and grime, and often with a depressingly empty poke of gold. The exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was a deep, bone-weary fatigue that settled into your very spirit. So, you're covered in grime, your muscles ache with a deep, persistent throb, and your hands are a roadmap of blisters and calluses from the endless swinging of that pickaxe and the swirling of that gold pan. You've managed to extract a few flakes of gold, perhaps enough to buy a meager meal and a warm-ish place to sleep. But as exhausting as the physical labor was, there was an invisible, far more insidious enemy lurking in every crowded camp, every stagnant puddle, and every shared communal space: disease. This wasn't just a risk, it was practically a guarantee, and for many, it was the ultimate, inescapable end to their gold rush dreams. Imagine thousands of men and a smattering of women and children suddenly congregating in remote, undeveloped areas. Sanitation, a concept barely understood even in established cities, was practically non-existent. You were living shoulder to shoulder in tents, makeshift shacks, or even just under the stars, often without access to clean water or proper waste disposal. The ground beneath your feet was a toxic stew of human and animal waste, discarded food scraps, and whatever else got thrown out. A mainstream historical fact is that cholera, dysentery, scurvy, and pneumonia were rampant. You didn't need a doctor to tell you something was wrong. The constant coughing, the prevalence of fevers, and the sheer number of fresh graves on the outskirts of every camp were grim indicators. Let's talk about the water. You needed water for everything: drinking, washing, rarely and inadequately, and, most importantly, for panning and sluicing your gold. This water, often drawn directly from the very streams you were polluting with your mining activities and human waste, was a breeding ground for bacteria and parasites. One quirky tidbit is that some miners would try to purify water by simply boiling it, but without understanding the nuances of waterborne diseases, this was often insufficient, and many still fell ill. You'd drink from a muddy stream, hoping for the best, only to find yourself doubled over with excruciating stomach cramps a few days later, a victim of dysentery. Diarrhea, often severe and debilitating, was so common it was almost considered a normal part of camp life, a cruel joke of the human body slowly expelling its life force. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was another silent killer. Your diet consisted largely of salted pork, beans, coffee, and hardtack, essentially non-perishable items that could survive the long journey west. Fresh fruits and vegetables were rare luxuries, almost impossible to find, and prohibitively expensive if they did appear. You'd start to feel lethargic, your gums would bleed, your teeth would loosen, and old wounds would reopen. Eventually, without proper nutrition, your body would simply shut down. Historians still argue whether the high death toll from disease in the gold fields was primarily due to a lack of medical knowledge or simply the overwhelming logistical challenges of providing sustenance and sanitation in such remote, rapidly formed communities. And then there was pneumonia, often brought on by exposure to the elements. You'd be working in freezing rivers all day or sleeping in damp, poorly insulated shelters at night. A sudden chill, a persistent cough, and then a fever that would consume you, leaving you gasping for breath. Medical care, if available at all, was primitive. Doctors were scarce, often unqualified, and their remedies were often more dangerous than the ailments themselves. You might find yourself being bled or given dubious concoctions of herbs and alcohol. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of germ theory. A simple cut could become infected, leading to gangrene and requiring amputation. A bad cold could quickly escalate into a fatal lung infection. The sheer vulnerability you felt was terrifying. You could be strong, healthy, and optimistic one day, and racked with fever, vomiting, or internal bleeding the next. Your gold wasn't worth much if you were too weak to dig it, and certainly not if you were dead. The fear of striking it rich was often overshadowed by the more immediate, primal fear of falling ill, knowing that help was miles away, and your only companions were other desperate, equally vulnerable men. It was a constant, low-level hum of anxiety that permeated every aspect of your life in the goldfields, a grim reminder that no matter how much gold you found, your body was a fragile vessel in a profoundly hostile environment. You couldn't just tough it out when it came to a raging fever or cholera. Nature, in its most bacterial form, always won. Even if you miraculously managed to dodge the claim jumpers and resist the creeping tendrils of disease, your troubles were far from over. Because, my friend, even if you found gold, you still had to eat. And in the wild, untamed boom towns of the West, the price of sustenance wasn't just high. It was often extortionate, a cruel tax on your desperate ambition. Imagine arriving in a remote mining camp, miles from any established city or farm. Everything you needed, food, tools, clothing, even basic luxuries like tobacco or a deck of cards, had to be hauled overland, often across hundreds of miles of treacherous terrain. The supply chains were tenuous, prone to disruption by weather, bandits, or simply the sheer inefficiency of frontier logistics. This scarcity, naturally, drove prices through the roof. A mainstream historical fact is that a single egg, a commonplace item back east, could cost you $1 or more in gold dust, which was a day's wages for many miners. Think about that. An entire day of back-breaking labor just for an egg. It sounds like a bad joke, doesn't it? Your diet, as we touched on, was grim. Salt pork, beans, flour, and coffee were your staples. Fresh meat was rare and expensive, often wild game that was tough and stringy. Vegetables were practically mythical. You craved something green, something crisp, something that wasn't beige and flavorless. This lack of nutrition contributed directly to illnesses like scurvy, weakening your body and dulling your spirit. You might be staring at a pile of gold dust you just panned, only to realize that it barely covers the cost of a few meager provisions for the coming week. It was a constant battle between what you earned and what you had to spend just to survive. You weren't accumulating wealth. You were merely exchanging one form of labor for another, less tangible one. Then there were the tools. Your shovel, your pickaxe, your pan. These weren't just implements. They were your lifelines. But if one broke or wore out, replacing it meant shelling out exorbitant sums. A pickaxe head might cost you what would be weeks of wages in a more civilized place. Nails, lumber, canvas for your tent. All were priced as if they were made of gold themselves. This meant that any small mishap, a broken handle, a torn shirt, could set you back significantly, eating into your already meager earnings. There was no Walmart or Amazon delivering to your remote mining claim. You were at the mercy of the few unscrupulous merchants who risked bringing goods to the frontier. A quirky tidbit about this economic absurdity is that often, the merchants and saloon owners made far more money than the miners themselves. They didn't have to brave the elements, risk disease, or get their hands dirty. They simply set up shop and extracted a steady stream of gold from the hopefuls who poured in. This led to a strange dynamic where the very people who were supposed to be serving the miners were often the ones truly striking it rich. You might joke, darkly, that the surest way to get rich in the gold rush wasn't to dig for gold, but to sell shovels. Historians still argue whether the inflated prices were a necessary evil due to logistics or pure profiteering on the part of the merchants. Regardless, you, the miner, bore the brunt of it, constantly facing the stark reality that your hard-earned gold quickly vanished into the pockets of others just to keep you alive. Every transaction felt like a tiny defeat, a chipping away at your dream. The dream wasn't just about finding gold, it was about keeping it. And that, in a world of scarce resources and predatory pricing, was almost as hard as finding it in the first place. You'd think that with a pocket full of gold dust, you'd feel secure. Instead, you'd feel the weight of its diminishing purchasing power, watching it melt away faster than snow in July. You've survived the treacherous journey, fended off claim jumpers, for now, endured the brutal physical grind, and even managed to sidestep the clutches of cholera and scurvy. You've paid exorbitant prices for your stale beans and tough salt pork. But even if you were the healthiest, most tenacious miner in the West, there was another enemy, a quiet, creeping, insidious one that could wear you down just as effectively: boredom. Imagine your day: wake before dawn, grab a quick, unappetizing breakfast, and then head to your claim. You swing a pickaxe, shovel dirt, pan for gold, or feed the sluice box. Hour after hour, day after day, the landscape, once novel, quickly becomes a monotonous blur of dirt, rocks, and the occasional scrub bush. There's no internet, no streaming services, no social media to distract you. Heck, there aren't even many books, and certainly no local library. Your entertainment options are pathetically limited. The sheer monotony of the labor was soul-crushing. Each swing of the pick, each swirl of the pan, was exactly the same as the last. There was little to stimulate your mind, no new challenges beyond finding another patch of promising dirt. You'd find yourself repeating the same motions, the same thoughts, over and over, until your mind felt as numb as your aching muscles. This isn't just about nothing to do. It's about the deep, psychological toll of unending, repetitive, and often unrewarding work. Historians still argue whether the psychological strain of boredom and isolation contributed more to miners abandoning their claims than the physical hardships. After the sun set, your options for recreation were equally bleak. You might sit around a smoky campfire, listening to the same tired stories from other weary prospectors. Conversations often revolved around the elusive big strike, the latest rumors of gold, or complaints about the prices at the general store. Small talk quickly devolved into silence, punctuated by the crackle of the fire and the distant howls of coyotes. You might try to write a letter home, but what would you say? Still digging, still haven't struck it rich, still eating beans. The disconnect from your previous life, from family and friends, grew wider with each passing, monotonous day. A mainstream historical fact about this period is the sheer lack of female companionship in the early gold camps. For every 100 men, there might be only 1 or 2 women, often working as cooks, laundresses, or saloon girls. This gender imbalance contributed significantly to the social isolation and pervasive loneliness felt by the vast majority of miners. You were surrounded by men, all with the same desperate hopes, and often the same grim resignation. There was little tenderness, little softness, little of the gentle comfort that human connection provides. A quirky tidbit that highlights the lengths people went to combat boredom. Some miners would keep pets, not just dogs or cats, but even trained squirrels or birds, simply for companionship and a break from the relentless human interaction, or lack thereof, with other gruff, exhausted men. You might find yourself having one-sided conversations with a chipmunk, just to hear the sound of your own voice saying something other than "another day, another dollar, if I'm lucky." The jokes you'd hear were often crude, repetitive, and probably not very funny after the 10th telling. You'd laugh, of course, because laughter, even forced laughter, was a release from the oppressive quiet of your own mind. The simple truth was that life in the gold fields was not just hard work. It was a profound exercise in enduring emptiness, a testament to the fact that even the most thrilling dream can turn into a tedious nightmare when stripped of novelty and joy. So you're bored. You're exhausted. You're probably half-starved for anything fresh that isn't made of beans and dust. What's a gold miner to do when the sun sets and the endless toil pauses? For many, the answer was to chase a different kind of glimmer, the false promise of escape found in alcohol, gambling, and vice. These weren't just pastimes. They were often the only accessible forms of entertainment, and they were designed to extract every last flake of gold from your worn-out hands. Imagine the typical boomtown saloon. It's a hastily constructed building, often little more than a tent or rough-hewn shack, smelling of stale beer, cheap tobacco, and desperation. The air is thick with smoke, the clatter of poker chips, and the mournful, off-key strains of a battered piano. You step inside, and for a moment, the dull ache in your muscles seems to lessen. Here, for a few precious hours, you can forget the back-breaking labor, the freezing water, and the crushing loneliness. The primary commodity, besides hope, was alcohol. Whiskey, often rock gut, doctored with who knows what, flowed freely. It was incredibly expensive, of course, priced to match the gold dust in your poke. A single shot might cost you an amount of gold equivalent to a whole day's digging. But after weeks of sobriety and endless toil, That burning liquid offered a temporary oblivion, a fleeting sense of warmth and camaraderie among strangers. A mainstream historical fact is that alcoholism was rampant in the mining camps, leading to countless brawls, ruined lives, and an even faster depletion of any gold found. You'd drink until the edges of your harsh reality blurred, until the promise of riches felt real again, even if just for a few short hours. Then there was gambling. Faro, poker, blackjack. These games of chance were played with a frenetic intensity, often for high stakes. You'd sit at a rough-hewn table, surrounded by other bleary-eyed miners, each hoping that a lucky hand would do what months of digging hadn't: deliver instant wealth. The house, of course, always had the advantage. Dealers were often skilled professionals, sometimes even cheats, and the odds were stacked against you. Many miners, after a week of hard labor and a few drinks, would blow their entire earnings on a single, desperate bet. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of gambling was a symptom of the desperation of the miners or a deliberate tool used by saloon owners to extract their wealth. One quirky tidbit is that some gambling halls employed shills, people pretending to be enthusiastic players, to encourage real miners to join the games and keep the money flowing. You'd be drawn in by the excitement, the thrill of possibility, only to watch your hard-won gold pile shrink, then vanish, leaving you with nothing but a pounding headache and a bitter taste in your mouth. And finally, there was the darker side of camp life. Prostitution was common, offering a different kind of fleeting escape for lonely men. Like everything else, it was expensive and often exploitative. These establishments, often operating out of the same saloons, were places where gold, hard-earned or otherwise, quickly disappeared. The cycle was brutal: work, drink, gamble, spend, wake up broke, and repeat. You might convince yourself that just one more hand, one more drink, would turn your luck around. But it rarely did. Instead, these vices acted as a siphon, draining away not just your gold, but your resolve, your health, and your last vestiges of hope. The temporary relief they offered was a hollow one, leaving you poorer in spirit and in purse, ready to face another day of brutal labor with even less to show for it. So, you're not just fighting the earth, the elements, and your own weary spirit. You're also battling the seductive, destructive pull of the saloon. You're barely scraping by, maybe just enough to cover your next meal and a few more rounds of watered-down whiskey. But even as you grapple with these personal demons, there's another layer of hardship, one that was often brutal and inescapable for many: the pervasive racial tensions and discrimination. The gold rush, especially in California, wasn't just a magnet for Americans. It drew people from all corners of the globe. You'd find aspiring miners from China, Mexico, Chile, France, Germany, and many other nations, all converging on the same limited patches of gold-rich land. On the surface, this sounds like a vibrant, multicultural melting pot. The reality, however, was far from harmonious. If you weren't a white American, particularly from the East, you faced a significant uphill battle, encountering prejudice, hostility, and often outright violence. Imagine arriving, having endured the same grueling journey, perhaps speaking little English, only to be met with suspicion and resentment. You'd quickly learn that the rules of the gold fields were often different for you. A mainstream historical fact is that various states, particularly California, enacted discriminatory laws specifically targeting foreign miners. The foreign miners tax, for instance, was a monthly tax levied on non-American miners. If you were Chinese or Latino, you might have to pay $20 a month or more, an exorbitant sum that could easily eat up any small earnings you managed to make. Failure to pay meant being driven off your claim, or worse, facing arrest or violent expulsion by local authorities or vigilante groups. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a deliberate, legal attempt to push you out, to protect the perceived interests of white American miners. Beyond the legal discrimination, there was the casual, brutal racism you'd encounter daily. If you were Chinese, you might be derisively called a coolie, your methods of mining dismissed, and your presence resented, especially if you worked communally, which white miners often saw as an unfair advantage. You might be physically assaulted, your property stolen, with little to no legal recourse. Historians still argue whether the economic anxiety over diminishing gold supplies or inherent xenophobia was the primary driver of such widespread discrimination. The truth is, it was likely a toxic brew of both. If you were of Hispanic descent, perhaps from Mexico or Chile, you faced similar hostility, often being branded as greasers and accused of being less civilized, despite many having extensive prior mining experience that far surpassed that of the American newcomers. A quirky tidbit is that miners from Sonora, Mexico, actually introduced many of the basic placer mining techniques, like dry washing, to the California gold fields, which were then widely adopted by others. Yet, despite their expertise, they were frequently targeted for violence and displacement. You'd see your compatriots driven from their claims at gunpoint, their efforts deemed worthless simply because of their ethnicity. This constant threat of discrimination meant that for many non-white miners, finding gold wasn't just about hard work. It was about navigating a treacherous social landscape where your very presence was deemed an affront. You might have to stick together with others from your own ethnic group for safety, forming small, insular communities within the larger, hostile camps. Even if you found gold, you knew it could be taken from you, not by a claim jumper looking for a better spot, but by someone who simply believed you had no right to be there, to be digging on their land, or to prosper from their gold. This added an unbearable weight to an already impossible existence, making the dream of riches feel like a cruel taunt for anyone who didn't fit the mold of the Anglo-American prospector. You weren't just digging for gold, you were digging for acceptance, and often, you found neither. So, you've seen the brutal realities of the gold fields, the back-breaking labor, the pervasive disease, the ruthless claim jumpers, the predatory merchants, and the insidious discrimination that haunted non-white miners. But the suffering wasn't confined to just the human inhabitants of these chaotic camps. The very earth itself, the source of all these dreams and miseries, also bore the scars of this relentless pursuit. The environmental devastation wrought by the gold rush was, and in many places still is, profound and lasting. Imagine a pristine river, clear and sparkling, teeming with fish. Now, picture that same river after thousands of miners have descended upon its banks. Your early methods of panning and sluicing, while rudimentary, still involved diverting water, digging up riverbeds, and sending silt and debris downstream. But as the easily accessible placer gold dwindled, more aggressive and destructive methods emerged, leading to an ecological nightmare. The most infamous of these was hydraulic mining. This wasn't something you, as a lone prospector with a shovel, would be doing, but its impact would be undeniable. Mainstream historical fact: massive cannons, called monitors, were used to blast high-pressure jets of water at ancient, gold-bearing hillsides. The sheer force of this water would literally wash away entire mountains, turning them into slurry that was then funneled through giant sluices to extract the gold. Sounds efficient, right? For the companies doing it, maybe. For the environment? Catastrophic. Think about the consequences. Millions of tons of earth, gravel, and sediment, laden with mercury, which, remember, was used to amalgamate gold, were washed into the rivers. These rivers, once clear and navigable, became choked with this mining debris, turning into thick, muddy torrents. The immediate impact on aquatic life was devastating. Fish populations plummeted as their habitats were destroyed. Downstream, once fertile farmlands were buried under feet of sterile mud and gravel, ruining crops and livelihoods. Rivers overflowed their banks, causing massive floods that reshaped the landscape in unnatural, permanent ways. Historians still argue whether the long-term ecological damage from hydraulic mining ultimately outweighed the economic benefits it produced for California. A quirky tidbit that illustrates the scale of this impact: the debris from hydraulic mining was so extensive that it caused significant silting in San Francisco Bay, hundreds of miles away, altering shipping channels and natural ecosystems. You wouldn't just see the destruction around your immediate claim. You'd see it in the murky, poisoned rivers, the stripped hillsides, and the dead forests in the distance. The air, too, would often be thick with dust from excavations, coating everything in a fine, gritty film. Beyond the massive operations, even your own small-scale efforts contributed. Diverting streams, stripping timber for fuel and construction, and generally churning up virgin soil all added to the cumulative effect. The landscape, once a wild, untamed beauty, was transformed into a scarred, barren wasteland in many areas, a testament to humanity's relentless pursuit of wealth. You might look out over a scene of such devastation and wonder if the fleeting promise of gold was truly worth the permanent marring of the earth. The wild, pristine West that had drawn you there was slowly, inexorably, being eaten away by the very industry it spawned, leaving behind not a golden paradise, but a landscape forever altered and often forever broken. As if the constant toil, disease, claim jumpers, price gouging, social isolation, and environmental ruin weren't enough. Mother Nature had one more brutal test waiting for you: winter's cruel embrace. You might arrive in the gold fields during the warmer months, full of hope, thinking only of sunshine and nuggets. But the Wild West, especially in the higher elevations where much of the gold was found, transformed into an entirely different beast when the cold winds blew and the snow began to fall. Imagine the already harsh conditions, then multiply them by the biting cold, the relentless damp, and the crushing isolation that only deep snow can bring. Your makeshift tent or flimsy cabin, barely a defense against a summer breeze, was utterly inadequate against freezing temperatures. You'd wake up shivering, your breath fogging in the frigid air, your water bucket often frozen solid. Mainstream historical fact: many miners succumbed to pneumonia, frostbite, or simply starved during the harsh winters, unable to work their claims or access supplies. The very ground, which was your livelihood, would freeze solid, making digging impossible. Your pickaxe, which usually chipped away at rock, would simply bounce off the iron-hard earth. The rivers and streams, your primary source for panning and sluicing, would often freeze over completely, bringing your work to a grinding halt. Even if they didn't freeze solid, the water would be agonizingly cold, numbing your hands within minutes, making the already difficult task of gold extraction an exercise in pure agony. You'd try to warm your hands by a meager fire, only to have them go numb again the moment you dip them back into the icy current. Historians still argue whether the winter months in the goldfields created a necessary period of rest and reflection for miners, or if they simply prolonged the suffering and hastened their departure. Supplies, already expensive and scarce, became even more so. Roads turned into impassable drifts of snow, cutting off camps from the outside world. Prices for basic necessities like flour and salt pork skyrocketed further, if they were even available. You might find yourself rationing food, tightening your belt a notch each day, watching your meager stores dwindle, praying for spring. The constant hunger pangs would be a dull background ache, a reminder of your vulnerability. A quirky tidbit: some desperate miners would resort to eating their mules or dogs, if they had any, when food supplies ran out during the deepest parts of winter. The concept of survival of the fittest became chillingly literal. Boredom, which was a challenge in summer, became an oppressive weight in winter. Trapped in small, often smoky cabins with a few other equally miserable men, conversation would inevitably dry up. The few opportunities for gambling or drinking would diminish as supplies ran out. The isolation was profound. You were cut off, unable to work, unable to leave, and often without any news from the outside world. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was the quiet of a frozen tomb, broken only by the howls of the wind and the crackle of your dwindling firewood. The psychological toll was immense. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months of inactivity, cold, hunger, and despair. Your dreams of striking it rich, which might have sustained you through the summer's hardships, would begin to feel like a cruel joke in the face of winter's relentless misery. You'd stare out at the endless white landscape, realizing that your grand adventure had become a test of mere survival, a prolonged period of endurance where the only goal was to simply make it to spring, hoping that the thaws would bring not just flowing water, but renewed hope. For many, winter was the final straw, the point at which they simply gave up and packed their bags, or worse, succumbed to the elements, their golden dreams buried beneath a blanket of snow. You've braved the relentless sun, the numbing cold, and the ever-present threat of starvation or disease. You've witnessed the land itself groan under the weight of human ambition. You've even managed to survive the winter, clinging to the hope that with the spring thaw, your luck will finally turn. But here's the harsh, unsentimental truth about the Wild West gold rush that few wanted to acknowledge. For the vast majority of miners, the dream of striking it rich remained just that, a dream. The elusive nature of success was the most bitter pill to swallow. You wouldn't just be competing with thousands of other desperate men. You'd be battling the geological reality that significant gold deposits were rare. While sensational newspaper accounts back east painted pictures of glittering nuggets practically lying on the ground, the reality was often fine gold dust, microscopic flakes, or gold embedded in hard quartz veins that required industrial-scale operations to extract. A mainstream historical fact is that only a tiny percentage of gold miners, estimates range from 1% to 5%, ever made a substantial fortune. The rest? They either broke even, lost money, or simply worked themselves to death for barely enough to survive. Imagine the daily grind. You spend 10, 12, 14 hours a day, every day, digging, shoveling, panning. You find a few specks here, a tiny flake there. You save them in your leather poke, watching them accumulate at an agonizingly slow pace. You compare notes with other miners, and everyone has a story about the big one they almost found, or the rich claim just over the next ridge that never quite materialized. You hear whispers of someone who did strike it rich, but these stories were always about someone else, a mythical figure whose success only served to highlight your own relentless mediocrity. Historians still argue whether the persistent belief in the big strike was an essential psychological coping mechanism or a dangerous delusion that kept miners trapped in an unrewarding cycle. The frustrating part wasn't just the lack of large nuggets, it was the sheer unpredictability. You could work one claim for months with little to show for it, only to hear that someone else, digging just 20 feet away, stumbled upon a rich pocket. Or you might work tirelessly on a promising vein, only for it to abruptly pinch out, meaning the gold simply vanished into the bedrock, leaving you with nothing but a hole in the ground and a mountain of wasted effort. This arbitrary nature of success bred a deep sense of injustice and fostered a desperate hope that prevented many from simply giving up. A quirky tidbit about this desperation is that many miners would develop an almost superstitious attachment to certain tools or rituals, believing they could somehow influence their luck, carrying lucky rocks or wearing certain charms, all in a futile attempt to bend fate to their will. For most, the reality was a life of bare subsistence. You'd earn just enough to cover the inflated cost of your food, your tools, and maybe a few rounds at the saloon to dull the pain of your existence. There was no real accumulation of wealth, no nest egg for the future, certainly no retirement plan. You were living hand to mouth, your entire existence dictated by the meager returns of your daily labor. The dream that had propelled you across a continent, that had fueled your every swing of the pickaxe, slowly but surely eroded, replaced by a dull resignation. You'd watch other men, equally exhausted, equally broke, pack up their meager belongings and shuffle out of camp, their dreams shattered. You'd wonder how long it would be before you were doing the same. Another nameless face swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape of the unfulfilled promise. You've seen the bitter truth. Most miners didn't strike it rich. They simply endured. And as the gold in one area inevitably dwindled, a phenomenon as predictable as the changing seasons would sweep through the camps, boomtown busts and ghost towns. This wasn't just an economic downer. It was the rapid, heartbreaking collapse of entire communities built on the fleeting hope of easy wealth, leaving behind eerie monuments to dashed dreams. Imagine a bustling camp, full of life, noise, and frantic activity. Saloons are overflowing, merchants are hawking their wares, and the sound of picks and shovels is incessant. You might have even invested a little of your meager earnings into a plot in this burgeoning town, thinking it was a wise move. But then, the whispers start. The gold is getting harder to find. The yields are dropping. Miners are leaving. Slowly at first, then in a flood, the population begins to thin. A mainstream historical fact is that many gold rush boomtowns lasted only a few years, or even months, before becoming completely deserted. As soon as the gold became unprofitable to extract, the miners, who were the town's entire economic engine, simply packed up and moved on to the next rumored strike. This rapid exodus left behind a literal ghost town, a stark reminder of the impermanence of the gold rush dream. You'd witness buildings, once vibrant with human activity, stand empty and decaying. Doors would creak open and shut in the wind. Windows would stare blankly like vacant eyes, and the silence would be profound, a stark contrast to the cacophony that once filled the air. The merchants, who had thrived on the miners' desperation, would be among the first to pack up, abandoning their high-priced goods or selling them off for pennies on the dollar. The saloon keeper, who once poured whiskey with a flourish, would simply walk away, leaving his bottles to gather dust. What was once a vibrant, if chaotic, community would become a desolate landscape of abandoned structures, rusting equipment, and the skeletal remains of forgotten dreams. Historians still argue whether the rapid rise and fall of these boomtowns contributed to a sense of rootlessness and transience among the population of the American West. A quirky tidbit that highlights the speed of these busts. Some boomtowns were built so quickly that buildings were constructed without foundations, designed to be disassembled and moved to the next strike as soon as the current one played out. You might even see entire saloons or general stores literally picked up and moved on wagons. But often, the move was too slow, or the destination proved to be another false promise, and the buildings were simply left to rot, testament to the fleeting nature of the gold. You'd walk through the deserted streets, perhaps picking up a discarded tin cup or a broken shovel, and feel the heavy weight of all the shattered hopes that had once animated this place. The wind would whistle through the empty window frames, carrying with it the silent echoes of laughter, shouts, and curses that once filled the air. For those who stayed behind, perhaps too stubborn, too poor, or too exhausted to move, the ghost town was a living tomb. There would be no work, no supplies, no one to talk to. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive, a constant reminder of what had been lost. The boomtown bust wasn't just a financial failure. It was the collapse of a social structure, leaving individuals isolated and adrift in a desolate landscape. You, having invested your sweat and tears, might find yourself one of the last few lingering souls, watching the final remnants of hope disappear over the horizon, another victim of the gold rush's relentless, cyclical nature. You've witnessed the ghost towns, the crumbling remains of dreams built on sand. For many, this was the end of the line, the point where the harsh reality finally extinguished the last flicker of hope. But what happened to you, the individual miner, once the gold ran out and the boom turned to bust? For a significant number, the answer wasn't a triumphant return home, but a continued struggle, a life forever altered by the gold rush, or simply an unmarked grave. This was the reality of the long road home, or not. If you were one of the truly fortunate few who actually struck it rich, well, congratulations. You might have bought a ticket back east, perhaps invested in a business, or even settled down somewhere more civilized. But those stories, as we know, were the rare exceptions, whispered legends that fueled the impossible dreams of the masses. For the vast majority, the journey back was just as arduous, if not more so, than the journey out. You'd be returning not with pockets full of gold, but with empty hands, a broken body, and a soul scarred by years of hardship. Think about it. You left your family, your community, your old life, perhaps selling everything you owned, all for this dream. To return empty-handed, to admit defeat, was a crushing blow to your pride. Many couldn't face it. They simply stayed in the West, drifting from one played-out camp to another, always chasing the next rumor, always just one more shovelful away from the mythical big one. They became perpetual prospectors, lost souls forever bound to the arid landscape, their lives defined by the chase rather than the capture. A mainstream historical fact is that many gold rush participants, even those who didn't find wealth, never returned to their original homes, choosing instead to settle in the West, becoming farmers, laborers, or establishing new towns in other burgeoning industries. You might have found yourself building railroads, working in timber, or starting a small farm, anything to escape the endless cycle of digging for elusive gold. For others, the toll of the gold fields was simply too great. Disease, injury, or the lingering effects of malnutrition would claim them. Many died anonymously, buried in shallow graves on the outskirts of camps, their names lost to history. Their families back home would wait for letters that never arrived, for a return that never materialized, left forever wondering about their fate. Historians still argue whether the romanticized image of the lone prospector contributed to the isolation and eventual disappearance of many miners, as their individual struggles often went unnoticed in the vastness of the frontier. A quirky tidbit that underscores this tragic reality: there are countless stories of lost mines in the West, but equally numerous are the stories of lost miners, individuals who simply vanished, swallowed by the wilderness, by a sudden illness, or perhaps by foul play, their dreams dissolving into the very earth they sought to exploit. You might have seen men simply walk away from their claims, their tools left behind, their last few dollars spent on a bottle of whiskey, heading off into the horizon with no clear destination, just a desperate need to escape. The mental anguish of failure, compounded by isolation and physical suffering, was a potent cocktail that led many to simply give up. So, while the gold rush promised boundless opportunity, for you, the average miner, it more often delivered a life of relentless struggle, leaving you either permanently scarred and broke, or simply vanishing into the annals of unrecorded history. The journey home, if it ever happened, wasn't a triumphal parade, but a quiet, often shameful retreat from a dream that had betrayed you, leaving you with little more than the grim satisfaction of having survived, if only barely, the ultimate test of endurance. So, you stand, perhaps a ghost of your former self, having endured the unyielding earth, the savage elements, the relentless toil, and the crushing disappointments of the gold rush. You might have made it out, or you might have simply faded into the vast, anonymous landscape of the West. But what, then, is the lasting takeaway from this era of frantic hope and widespread despair? The true legacy of hardship, not riches, is the final, sober truth of the Wild West gold rush. Forget the romanticized images of lucky prospectors striking it rich and riding off into the sunset. That was the exception, a tantalizing fantasy perpetuated by newspapers and opportunistic merchants. For the vast majority of people who flocked to the gold fields, the experience was one of unremitting struggle, poverty, and often premature death. A mainstream historical fact is that the average miner barely made enough to cover his living expenses, and many ended up in debt. The real wealth generated by the gold rush didn't flow into the pockets of individual prospectors. It fueled the growth of industries, transportation networks, and ultimately, the burgeoning cities of the West, transforming the landscape and the nation in ways few could have predicted. You were, in essence, a cog in a much larger, often brutal machine. Your backbreaking labor contributed to the foundational wealth that built states like California, but you personally saw little of it. The gold you painstakingly extracted flowed upwards, enriching bankers, industrialists, and the savvy few who sold the shovels, the whiskey, and the salt pork. Historians still argue whether the gold rush was a net positive for the individual participants or a grand illusion that consumed countless lives for the benefit of a select few in the broader economic development of the nation. It's a debate that lingers, much like the ghost towns themselves. A quirky tidbit that underlines this point: the very term gold rush implies a sudden, easy influx of wealth. In reality, it should perhaps be more accurately called the hardship rush or the labor rush, as that was the dominant experience for almost everyone involved. You learned resilience, certainly. You learned to endure pain, hunger, and loneliness. You learned the brutal indifference of nature and the casual cruelty of your fellow man. But these were lessons forged in the fires of adversity, not in the comfortable glow of prosperity. The Wild West gold rush wasn't a shortcut to wealth. It was a crucible. It stripped away pretensions, exposed vulnerabilities, and demanded an almost superhuman level of endurance. You went seeking gold, but what you often found instead was a profound understanding of human limits, both physical and psychological. You learned that true wealth wasn't necessarily measured in nuggets or dust, but in the simple act of survival, in the fleeting moments of camaraderie, and in the grim satisfaction of simply putting one foot in front of the other, day after day, year after year, in pursuit of an ever-receding dream. Your legacy, and the legacy of countless others like you, isn't about the gold you found, but about the immeasurable cost of the search itself. And now, as the last echoes of pickaxes fade and the dust settles over those sun-baked, ghost-ridden hills, we slowly drift away from the harsh realities of the Wild West. Let the images soften, the rough edges blur, and the sounds of struggle quiet down. The sun dips below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of deep violet and fading orange, a gentle lullaby for a weary soul. Imagine the vast, silent expanse of the night sky, billions of stars twinkling like tiny, distant gold dust, indifferent to the humans striving below. Your bed is soft, your pillow cool against your cheek. The world outside, with all its demands and anxieties, can wait. Just breathe in and let your worries drift out with a slow, gentle sigh. The pursuit of gold, with all its sweat and tears, is a distant whisper now, fading into the comfortable quiet of your room. Close your eyes, let your muscles relax, and allow yourself to sink deeper into the embrace of peaceful sleep. Everything is calm, everything is still. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.